Welcome, listener. This is Sebastian Nothwell, here to introduce you to my gay Victorian fae romance, Oak King Hollyking. Please enjoy the first chapter of the audiobook, narrated by Gary Furlong. And as always, thank you for listening.
The Court of the Silver Wheel, the Fae Realms, Autumnal Equinox. The crisp wind howled across the tourney field, scattering scarlet leaves. Their hue matched the blood trickling from the wounds of the fallen, who lay in a haphazard pattern as if the wind had scattered them as well. Some struggled upright and limped towards the boundary of the melee, where their squires and servants waited amidst the roaring crowd to staunch their wounds. Some crawled. Some could do little more than groan as they waited out the battle's end. A few would never rise again. Two combatants remained on their feet, their sword hilts locked together in a contest of brute strength, their snarling faces inches apart. Shrike, who had slain several of the corpses on the field, stared unblinking into the mercurial eyes of his opponent. These eyes belonged to a knight whom the court considered quite beautiful, and it was said those eyes altered their colour with his moods. To Shrike they had appeared gleaming green when the battle commenced. Now they'd faded to an icy blue and paled with every passing second. The knight's lips had taken on a blue tinge as well, twisted in a lupine snarl to reveal doubled canines as sharp as his longsword. The blood-slicked blade crossed against Shrike's own to form a shining scarlet X between their close-pressed chests. The well-honed edges, Shrike's with more nicks and notches, scraped against the ringed mail beneath the knight's tabard and scored the leather armour of a Shrike's tunic. "Yield!" the knight hissed between clenched teeth. Some scant moments before, an errant shield bash had split Shrike's lip open. Shrike had cut down the shield's wielder, who now lay groaning into the dirt a stone's throw away. Still Shrike's lip bled. He licked the blood from his chin now and darted his head forward between the crossed blades to crush the knight's mouth beneath his kiss. The knight jerked his head back, or attempted to at least, before Shrike bit his tongue, and in that instant of shock and outrage, Shrike sank his dagger into the hollow beneath the knight's flailing left arm. Blood poured forth. Each successive wave came weaker than the last, the blade having pierced the knight's heart. The hot torrent soaked through Shrike's tunic sleeve. The copper stench of fresh spilt blood joined with the miasma of gore that hung over the tourney field. Shrike stared into the knight's eyes as their ice blue faded to silver white. Then they rolled back, and the knight collapsed in Shrike's arms. His sword scraped against Shrike's cheek as it fell to the ground. Blood for blood, Shrike supposed, and dropped him. The victory horn resounded over the tourney field. The rising cheer of the crowd swallowed up its echo. Few of the fae scattered around him were dead. Fae did not perish so easily. Even a knife to the heart could heal with time. The mercurial-eyed knight, like most of his rank lying broken over the tourney field, had a squire, a page, and very likely a gentle lover to tend his wounds and mend his armour, so he might fight another day. Shrike, as a mere knave, had none. He would not have been permitted to stride out on the tourney field at all if the Queen had not called for a general melee, in which fae of all rank could compete for her favour. And as the pages and squires and gentle friends swarmed the battlefield to rescue the wounded, Shrike stumbled through alone, a single minnow swimming against their overwhelming current, towards his queen. The queen of the Court of the Silver Wheel sat at the northernmost end of the tourney field. Her servants had erected a temporary bower, coaxing a copse of hemlock trees to grow into a shelter for their queen. Their scaly trunks twisted together like a nest of snakes for a floor, and their flat needles of brightest green came together overhead to filter rays of the setting sun like stained glass. Stout lower branches forked into stools for handmaidens and courtiers. Thrust forth from the centre like the bow of a ship, a balcony emerged with two thrones. On the tallest and centremost throne sat the queen herself, perched on the edge of her seat, her delicate white hands laid on the braid of branches that formed the balcony's rail. In the lower throne at her left hand, set back from the balcony's edge, sat the Holly King, her champion until Yule. A ring of knights, those whose service the queen deemed too important to permit their participation in the tournament, surrounded the base of the bower. Each wore her livery, a silver wheel on a cobalt blue field, and stood ready to defend her person and her honour. At her nod, her knights withdrew to let him pass, and he climbed up into her bower. The splendor without proved nothing compared to the splendor within. Paper lanterns filled with blue fireflies augmented the green sunshine, and maidens and courtiers garbed in feathers and silks twittered together like so many songbirds, yet all with at least one of their eyes on their queen, lest she should require their prompt service. Her servants, human and fey alike, had piled a feast on a raised dais in the centre of the bower. A whole roast boar formed the centrepiece, large enough for a half-dozen warriors to ride on. Its tusks now speared apples instead of flesh. A peacock, skinned for cooking and then meticulously redressed in its own brilliant plumage, spewed from the boar's propped-open mouth. Several swans had received the same treatment, flanking the boar with their spread wings. The boar's mortal blow, an enormous gash in its left side, gaped open to hold a fountain of wine, with bunches of grapes spilling from the lips of the wound. Amidst these showier pieces lay scattered piles of strawberries, apples, pears, citruses, bird tongues, whole-roasted mice, and tiny knights and horses made of pastry and marzipan fighting all over the feast. Shrike spurned it all. The queen and her holly king had turned their respective thrones, the living hemlock branches bending to their whims, to face into the bower where Shrike now stood. The holly king wore a crown of sharp green leaves that befit his title. The blood-red berries bejeweling it matched his crimson eyes, which burned into Shrike. As the holly king turned this same gaze on everyone, however, and furthermore he wasn't by far the first fey to have turned such a gaze on Shrike in particular, Shrike paid it little heed. This day, halfway between midsummer and midwinter, marked the point at which the holly king's power would begin to wane. As Shrike glanced over the holly king now, he saw little proof of this. The holly king's high cheeks had not hollowed, nor had his well-muscled limbs wasted away. His skin had a bluish tinge, but then again it always had, and the frost in his silvery hair glistened bright as ever. Shrike had only ever glimpsed the queen from afar. Now as he drew nearer to her than he had ever dared before, the radiance of her beauty proved no mere poetical affectation. The autumnal winds blowing across the tourney field lost all their chill as he drew closer. The cold blood dripping from his wounds warmed, and the sunlight filtering down from gold to green through the hemlock needles brightened. Her hair shone the same strawberry gold shade as the sunset. It spilled forth from beneath her delicate diadem of heather and starlight, and flowed down to pool at the trailing hem of her emerald green gown, which precisely matched the shade of her sparkling eyes. The rosebuds of her cheeks and lips provided all the colour in her otherwise milk-white flesh. "Kneel, Butcher of Blackthorn," said the queen. Shrike dropped to one knee and bowed his head. Pointed crimson leaves blew across the knotted branches beneath his boot heels. By this time the wounded and their attendants had withdrawn from the field. The remaining spectators, some 1,000 strong, regathered beneath the queen's bower. Shrike glimpsed them through the braided branches of the balcony rail, all staring upward to see what boon their queen would grant to the tournament's victor. The queen's sword sang out as it left its sheath, the sweet ring of metal against metal. The slender blade, wielded with all the gentle precision of a moth's wing, came to its rest first on Shrike's left shoulder, then his right. "And arise," the queen continued. Shrike held his breath in anticipation of the title she would grant him. With it would come the loss of many freedoms, yes. But he'd tallied up the exchange long before he made the first move that brought him to this moment, and considered the ensuing security worth the forfeit. If he laboured in her service and under her protection, he needn't suffer any knight-errant's raid. Furthermore, with a title from the queen, he could force all contenders to look him in the eye and acknowledge his skill and craft were worthy of his ambition. As to the form the title took, he cared not. More than likely he would be declared Knight of Blackthorn, as his minor freehold would become hers once she took him into her service. Or perhaps she would grant him a more creative sobriquet. "King," said the queen, "of the oak." The taste of victory turned to ash on his tongue. His head shot up before he could even think of restraint. Shock parted his lips, betrayal burned in his eyes. The queen gazed down with an expression no less serene for the death sentence she had handed down on his head. Behind her, just over her left shoulder, the holly king's mouth twitched in something almost like a smile. Shrike wasted a half-second staring at his predestined opponent, then snapped his eyes back to the queen. Still she appeared unmoved. "Arise," she repeated, "my oak king." Shrike staggered upright. All grace had flown from his limbs along with the queen's favour. His mind reeled. He'd won her tournament. Buckets of blood had spilled beneath his blade and flowed over his hands to prove his strength and fealty. He couldn't think what he'd done to displease her. Perhaps, he thought as she smiled her inscrutable smile and cast a considering look over him from the crown of his head to the heels of his boots, he'd pleased her all too well. The spectators surged forth with a joyous roar. The true feasting began, with servants carrying forth a half-dozen more wine-spewing balls from the bower into the crowd, and the throng tangling all limbs in a frenzied dance to celebrate the harvest. Shrike withdrew from the queen's presence with a bow, and slipped away in the ensuing chaos. A well-placed knee here and a sharp elbow there carved his path from the centre of the festival to the encroaching forest at its edge. The illumination of the rising bonfires behind him didn't reach far into the trees, with their ancient trunks so broad and the undergrowth so thick between them. Shrike drew his sword and hacked his way deeper into the darkness. The dense greenery swallowed the noise of the revels, with only the rustling of new growth creeping up behind him as he went. It didn't grieve him to leave the celebration behind. He had no time to lick his wounds, much less join the throng. He had a silver wheel to splinter. Some minutes or hours after he began striking his own path through the woods, he reached a thicket ringed with pale mushrooms. He wiped his sword clean on the hem of his tunic, then sheathed it before collapsing at the base of an immense oak. Its roots grew as thick around as his own waist and formed a rudimentary throne. Fitting, he thought, as the queen had titled him after the same. Yet he couldn't allow himself to wallow in bitterness, nor could he yield to the siren song of sleep, with the sting of the cut on his cheek and the deep ache of the bruises beneath his armour. Instead he plucked a silver strand from amidst his black locks, some 13 inches long, and selected an acorn from the hundreds scattered across the ground. He tied the hair around the stem of the acorn's cap. Holding his left hand out before him, he dangled the acorn over it, a mere quarter-inch above his palm. He waited until it stopped swaying, stopped spinning, and then waited another moment for absolute stillness. "I seek that which will allow me to prevail over the Holly King," Shrike intoned, "his current incarnation, and in all his future forms. Where shall I find my quarry?" The makeshift pendulum shivered on its thread, then began to swing, a hair's breadth at first, then further and further, rippling outward until its path traced a particular line etched in Shrike's palm. Shrike frowned down at it. He clenched his hand into a fist, shook out the pendulum and tried again. It traced the same line with renewed vigour. Shrike broke off the thread and popped the acorn into his mouth. It tasted almost as bitter as the queen's favour. Chewing it burst open the half-healed wounds in his cheek and lip. As the acorn crunched between his molars, he considered the directions it had given. He would not find his answer in the court of the Silver Wheel, nor in any of the Fey courts. His quest, it seemed, must take him into the mortal realm. Staple Inn, London, England, 23rd of September, 1844. Fog swelled outside the thick glass panes latticed with leading. Its hue and viscosity looked almost identical to the grey sludge of milk and tea sitting in the chipped cup and mismatched saucer beside Wren Lofthouse's inkwell. Every so often the dark speck of a sparrow would dart through the fog, coming perilously near to the window before veering off again. The dark specks of ink spatter in Wren's tea never veered off. Wren gazed down at these specks, and unable to summon any feeling stronger than resignation, quaffed the whole remainder in 2 gulps, ink and all, before returning to his ledger. On a day like any other spent clerking at Staple Inn, Wren might as well drink ink. It would make no difference. Indeed, it hardly seemed to alter the tea's flavour one jot, which, Wren supposed, he could only blame on himself. After all, it had been he who had brewed it in the copper kettle over the smouldering coals in the hearth. Another sparrow swooped past the window. Wren glanced up at it, suppressed a jealous twinge, then looked across the law office to the desk opposite, where sat the sole other occupant, Mr. Ephraim Grigsby, Esquire. Mr. Grigsby, a bachelor of some 60 years, had an unfortunate resemblance to an egg balanced on stilts. Still, he bore it up better than Wren bore any of his own burdens. Indeed, He seemed to thrive on the monotony of receiving rents, drawing up and executing wills, and rearranging columns of figures from one ledger to another. His weathered face remained in the same placid attitude as one might see in a gentleman fishing away the afternoon. Wren, a bachelor of a mere 30 years, felt nothing like the same serenity with his situation, and had resolved to take his razor to his throat if he ever drew near it. For the present moment, however, he dipped his pen nib into his inkwell with a sigh. The muffled silence of the office shattered as the bell rang in the hall. As if compelled by clockwork mechanism, Wren set aside his pen and rose from his desk to weave his way between bookshelves, cabinets, and stacks of ledgers toward the door at the opposing end of the chamber. "Lofthouse," Mr. Grigsby said without looking up from his desk. Wren didn't slow his stride, much less stop to hear him. Mr. Grigsby continued on regardless. "I believe the penny post has arrived. If it wouldn't trouble you overmuch, would you be so kind as to go down and—" "Oh, thank you," he said, glancing up at last to find Wren halfway through the open door, latch in hand. A tight smile twitched at the corners of Wren's mouth. The old man deserved better, but it was the best Wren could manage on a Monday, as he slipped out of the office and pulled the door shut behind him. Yet even as Wren stepped into the hall, he heard the thud of boot heels on floorboards, and as he peered over the railing down the steep and narrow staircase into the foyer below, he beheld a curious figure. The figure stood tall enough that it had to duck under the doorframe to enter the foyer. Any other hint as to its shape remained hidden under an immense black cloak. The hood cast the face into deep shadow, assuming there existed a face at all beneath it. Wren began to doubt it as he watched the figure ascend the stair, looking as if it glided up the steps as smoothly as one might glide down the banister, and yet accompanied by the sound of heavy footfalls beneath the cloak's sepulchral folds. The cloak's hem trailed behind the figure, flowing upwards like a waterfall in reverse, its dusty and tattered edges resembling black and grey feathers. Wren, whose ceaseless prayers for escape from the tedium had never been answered before, stared in frank disbelief, and quite forgot he was expected to do anything else until the figure had reached the upper landing and loomed over him like a gnarled oak. Before Wren could address the astonishing shadow directly, a pair of hands gloved in black leather emerged from beneath the cloak and threw back its pointed hood to reveal an equally pointed black hat with a long grey and black striped feather adorning its black band. The face beneath this hat proved no less bizarre. Wren beheld a black Venetian mask, its leather tooled in a feathered pattern, with a long pointed nose like a beak. A ragged black scarf, so full of holes that it seemed halfway between fishing net and lace, swathed the stranger from throat to nose. Beneath the mask, two dark eyes smouldered like coals. The scent of wood smoke, not just of a wood stove or a hearth, but that of a raging bonfire, hung in the hall. The stranger could not be the queerest sight in all of London, but by Wren's estimation he was the queerest sight in Staple Inn, certainly the queerest figure to ever grace the chambers of Mr. Ephraim Grigsby, Esquire and Clerk. Still, on the off chance that the stranger was not in fact a wormwood tonic-induced hallucination, Wren felt he probably ought to say something. "Your name, sir?" Wren asked, covering his confusion with his blandest professional tone. The smouldering eyes beneath the mask flew wide. Impatience drove out the last of Wren's wonder. "Your face, at least? You're quite in out of the fog, and you needn't fear its chill any longer." The stranger's hunched shoulders relaxed, and the gloved hands came up again, this time to untie the mask, pull down the scarf, and sweep the hat from the head in a brisk bow. Wren kept his own hair unfashionably long, with the tips of the longest strands brushing his collar, but he felt positively well trimmed when compared against the unknown gentleman. Night black locks shot through with starlight silver spilled over the stranger's shoulders as he bent forward despite the leather cord tying them at the nape of his neck, just visible where the hood had fallen back. As the stranger rose from his bow, Wren beheld his face at last. The stranger appeared not many years older than Wren himself. His dark eyes and high cheekbones would strike even the most discerning taste as handsome. His nose proved almost as long and pointed as the mask's beak, paired with a swarthy complexion and full lips worthy of an ancient Roman emperor or a modern gondolier. His sweeping black brows lent a stormy intrigue to his countenance. A raw red line with white, pinched edges carved down his left cheek. A wound which had just begun to scar proved his only flaw. Wren realized not only was he staring at the stranger, but his own mouth had fallen open in the meantime. His teeth clicked together as he shut his jaw. "Good morning, sir." Wren turned to find Mr. Grigsby had wandered to the door and now looked over the stranger with an expression equal parts astonished and intrigued. "Do forgive, Lofthouse," Mr. Grigsby continued. "I'm afraid I work him rather too hard, and he hasn't much patience left for conversation. But to the purpose. What may we do to assist you?" The stranger looked almost as astonished to see Mr. Grigsby. His black eyes swept from his bald pate to his knock-knees, then flicked over to Wren once more. With hesitation, the stranger asked, "Is this your master?" "After a fashion," Wren admitted. It took him a half-second too long to do so, for to hear the stranger speak quite unsettled him. The stranger's voice rumbled forth from deep within his chest, low and looming, reverberating in Wren's ears. The stranger returned his attention to Mr. Grigsby. "Then forgive me, my lord, for it seems my purpose lies not with you, but with your squire." Mr. Grigsby appeared not in the least perturbed by this, which Wren put down to his being inured to sour dispositions and rude speech after suffering Wren's indifferent service for too many years. On the contrary, he laughed. "Squire, my, how fanciful. Very well, then, he is at your service. Only pray don't keep him over long. Indispensable he is, my good sir, indispensable." And with the least subtle wink Wren had ever seen, Mr. Grigsby whisked himself away back into the office and shut the door behind him, leaving Wren alone in the hall with the stranger once more. If nothing else, Wren supposed he could take Mr. Grigsby's direct address of the stranger as proof that the stranger was not, in fact, a hallucination. Still, the possibility of a hoax remained, and while Wren might fail as a clerk in many respects, he'd be damned before he'd allow Mr. Grigsby to become as much of a laughing-stock as Mrs. Tottenham. The stranger furrowed his formidable brow at the closed office door, then looked down at Wren. "If you are not your master's squire, then you must be his page, unless— Is your master not a Knight Templar?" "He most certainly is not," Wren replied, bristling. "He is a lawyer, sir." "Then what are you?" Wren did not often encounter anyone as blunt as himself. It almost tricked him into giving a true answer. Instead, he resigned himself to reply, "I am a clerk. I wish you would state your business at once, sir, as I have much to do and little time to spend standing about in corridors consulting with lunatics." "If you have so little time as you say," the stranger countered, "perhaps we should meet elsewhere, when you are more at liberty, for I have too much to explain at present." How convenient, Wren thought. Aloud, and as much to appease his curiosity as to arrange a meeting, Wren asked, "When and where would you suggest?" "Name your place and time. I am at your mercy." Wren thought he'd prepared himself to expect anything from the stranger, yet that final phrase gave him pause. In life he'd more often found matters quite the other way around. The stranger, meanwhile, appeared unaware he'd said anything strange, and awaited his answer with the patience of an oak. "The Green Man," Wren blurted. "Tonight, 8 o'clock. The stranger conceded with a nod. "As you wish." He turned and descended the stair in the same queer fashion, reached the lower landing, and had his hand on the door latch before Wren recovered his senses enough to reply. "And whom shall I say is waiting for me, sir?" Wren called down, his frustration lending the question a bitter aftertaste. The stranger paused at the bottom of the stair and glanced up to meet Wren's eyes again with that burning gaze. "Butcher," he said. Then he donned his mask, threw his hood over his hat, and stalked through the door. The wind slammed it shut behind him.
That was the first chapter of Oak King Holly King, narrated by Gary Furlong. If you enjoy what you've heard, you can find the complete audiobook on Audible, Chirp, Libro.fm, Spotify, or through your local library on Libby and Hoopla. Thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in next week for more Right Here, Right Queer.